very quickly run through the issues that we looked at in the book. We began studying the conflict and writing books about it anyway from about from the time of the Second Intifada. So the More Bad News from Israel was actually the third book that we'd done. The other two were Bad News from Israel, and then we did the history of it, Israel and Palestine. But what drew me into it was the sense of the complete absence of how this conflict was to be understood from the point of view of the Palestinians. I became very interested in it. I mean, I'd lived in Israel and I'd seen it firsthand, but I was also struck with, I had many friends who were journalists, and one said to me, I think probably in 1996, he'd said to me, you know, no one is ever going to understand this conflict unless they understand about water. And I was thinking, well, nobody says that on the television. It's completely absent. You know, the notion that as he said, that the settlers were digging deep bore wells, that the Palestinian villages were going dry, that there was a conflict in essence over resources. This was essentially a conflict in which a powerful dominant occupying force was helping itself to the resources of an occupied people. And that image of it was just completely absent from television. And then when the Second Intifada broke out, I then thought, well, it would be a relatively straightforward thing for us to record the programs, to do an analysis, to see what sorts of information was being given to people about the history of the conflict and about the origins of it from the perspective of different groups, and why it was particularly that, as it turned out, as we did more and more work, that the history of the conflict was absent, and specifically the history of the conflict from the point of view of the Palestinians. So you might remember this from the first book, that we analysed thousands and thousands of lines of coverage. I think we took samples of television programs, transcribed them, and then counted lines just to see what was there. And I think we looked at something like 4,500 lines of media coverage. And in that whole 4,500, there were 16 lines that related to the history of it, that mentioned refugees, or that mentioned the reasons for it from the point of view of the Palestinians in terms of their own history. And you might have, I don't know if any of you heard me, but I was asked to go onto Radio 4, of all things, onto the Today program in the most recent attack on Gaza. In the middle of it, there was a lot of arguments about the media coverage, and there'd been demonstrations outside the BBC, and I was asked to go onto the Today program. I've no idea how that happened. I was very surprised. They rang me up at 11 o'clock at night. I could only assume that the people who were supposed to be in charge of the program were on holiday or something like that. You know, I could think, because these people who were, didn't, and they were saying to me, do you know about Israel and Palestine? Yes, I know a little bit, I said, and so I went on, and when I was on the radio, I said that I'd spoken to many journalists, and I had been told quite clearly that the perspective that they could not get on to the BBC was the Palestinian view that they were living under a brutal apartheid regime, and that this related to the whole history of the setting up of Israel, to the expulsion of refugees, to the taking of Palestinian land, to ethnic cleansing, to the absolute control of every aspect of Palestinian life through either the blockade or different forms of control. And I said words, to that effect on the radio, and the sense of shock around me, and the person who was interviewing me was saying, these are very serious things to say. And I said, yes, they are, aren't they? Extremely serious. The issue is, why aren't they said more often? And that, I think, is a crucial point to think about. Why aren't they said more often? I mean, we can give rather obvious answers to that, but the question is, what can we do about it? And if you look at the propaganda, at the public relations from the point of view of Israel, it's clear that they use the most sophisticated, most developed techniques that exist in public relations. That each person who speaks is briefed very well. They have a range of chosen speakers, whether it's the ambassadors or whether it's a particular spokespeople or government ministers, but they will all be absolutely on message in terms of what is to be said, what the core, what they would call, what public relations people would call the core take-home message is. And they train and train and they test these messages with focus groups, and it's absolutely clear. And you know, if I said the messages to you, you would have heard them 1,000 times. You know that Hamas is a terrorist group. If only the Palestinians would stop attacking us. We want to live in peace. We're a democracy. No civilized democracy could possibly be subject to these attacks. That as long as the Palestinians keep attacking us, we have to retaliate. I mean, you must have heard those phrases again and again and again. And they are said again and again and again until they are rooted into the minds of the people who are listening. And they are done to establish those very simple relationships of cause and effect, so that people have in their mind that simple juxtaposition. The Palestinians attack and the Israelis have to respond. And then we found, when we were analyzing this, not for the recent attack, but for the attack in 2008, and actually there were very, very many common features in terms of both the attack but also the media coverage of it. But what we found when we went out into the focus groups and we asked people and started to interview people, they can repeat word for word those phrases, that if only the Palestinians would stop attacking. And what the journalists were doing, I think partly because there were such levels of intimidation, that they were under great pressure, I think, themselves as journalists, what they tended to do in their own heads and in their own productions for the news was they operated a form of balance which put the damage and suffering of the Palestinians on one side, and then the Israeli explanations on the other of why it was all happening. And that became for them a kind of balance. And I have to say, very senior journalists confirmed that to me and said that they thought that was what had happened. And I think it happened very much again the second time in the more recent attack. But what then happens is that when people see the suffering of Palestinians and they see the terrible things that are done, they say, yes, it's awful. I'm talking about members of the public, you know, when you go out and randomly choose people. They will say, yes, it's awful. Yes, it's terrible. And the suffering, the Palestinians are suffering. Yes, it's terrible. And I remember somebody saying to me, I cried when I saw the images of the Palestinian babies and the children who'd been killed. I cried. And then the next thing the person said was, but if only the Palestinians would stop firing the rockets, then there could be peace, you know. And so that sense in which you have the imagery of the Palestinians on one side and the explanations on the other, it does a lot to reduce the criticism of Israel. I mean, a huge amount, actually. Now, this time, if you want to put it that way, in the most recent attack this year, what happened was that there was really a lot of imagery of the suffering and levels of destruction that took place. So I began to sense something of a change in mood, not in terms of the explanation of why it's happening and the historical reasons or any of that. And I think, you know, when I did that radio program, the people from the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign said to me that they thought that was the first time they'd ever heard on a major radio program like that anybody using words like apartheid and talking about the history of the refugees. And it's so rare that dimension to explanation is still very largely excluded. But what we did get this time was a great deal of coverage of the destruction. And I think that started to move some things, because people, you could hear people speak. I haven't done a study of this, so I'm only judging from rather limited experience on this. But what I sensed in terms of conversations and the kinds of groups and the interviews that we sort of routinely do, what I sensed was that there was a kind of common sense, if you want to put it that way, a kind of critique of what was being done by Israel, which stayed at the level of it was disproportionate, or it was unacceptable, or it was out of order doing that. Nobody was talking about apartheid or control or anything like that, but not amongst, in my experience, of the general public. But what you did find was people saying, well, you can't really act like that. You can't do that. I mean, like Britain's been attacked. For example, people might say, Britain's been attacked, and you know, like there was bombs going off here, and the IRA let off bombs here, but the British government didn't bomb Donegal or something. They didn't flatten the Falls Road or something because they thought there might be an arms catch there or something. You know, so there was a sort of, if you like, a kind of common sense rationale applied to it that this was just too much. But of course, the task is to go beyond that, to push for a much more sophisticated explanation of why this has happened, of what is constituted by the Israeli state, what it means to have a military occupation, a military rule. I mean, when I was on that radio program, I insisted on calling it a military occupation, because one of the things that we've found, and you probably have as well, that many people in the public don't understand what it means to be occupied. You hear the word occupied, and it's used sometimes on television, but we found when we first started the study that there were really a lot of people who thought the Palestinians were occupying the occupied territories, because they thought the word occupied meant that people were on the land, like a bathroom's occupied or a toilet's occupied. They thought it just meant somebody was there. And they didn't realize this was about military control, military rule. And when we asked about things like curfews, I can remember people saying, oh, that's quite nice to have a curfew, isn't it? Because it keeps people safe, you know. And they had this idea of having a curfew in the Second World War or something, and getting people in and tucked up in shelters. And, you know, they didn't see it in terms of a military rule, military control, anything like that. So there's a sense of explaining a long way beyond what people understand now. But that is beginning to happen. I think it's beginning to happen through activist groups, through much better local media coverage. I mean, I've noticed on local radio, I mean, people rang me from different stations, you know, BBC local radio in different parts of the country, and who were much more geared up to this. And they would do quite long interviews with me and put these out, and I would say very, very clearly what I thought the issues were. So, and of course, in local media, local press, and through social media, there's a lot of opportunity now to put out different alternative ways. And of course, one of the other enormous issues here is the issue of the boycott, which is, of course, had a huge impact. And it is, I think, one of the ways in which it's very easy to draw people's attention, you know, in the general public and in the course of day-to-day life, going shopping, in everyday life, to say to people, actually, if you buy things from that are from the occupied territories, or if you support Israel, if you support the products that are being sold to you in this from a regime like this, then you are aiding apartheid, and that is, I think, such a powerful thing to say, and I think it's a very, very important issue to raise, that And I think in the way Desmond Tutu said that, that Israel itself can never be free in its own citizens. It can never have a peaceful society. It can never have a peaceful life for its own people as long as it's engaged in military control of such a huge number of people. And that is such an obvious, clear thing to say to people, and to say that every aspect of Palestinian life is controlled and run by Israel is such an important message to get across. And in that particular case, when the woman who I was speaking to said that she had that she had cried when she'd seen the pictures of the babies and the children, and then she said, but if only the Palestinians would stop, and I said, and at the end of discussion, I said, just by the way, the Hamas had actually offered, very early on, it was being said that they would agree to stop firing rockets if Israel would lift the blockade. And the response of this woman, who was middle class, a teacher, was absolutely real shock. She said, that couldn't be true, that can't be true. She said, that just, if that was true, I would have heard it, she said. And I said, well, actually, she said, who said that? Who said that? And I said, well, actually, it was the ex-head of the Israeli Secret Services of Shin Bet. He said it was all in the Israeli papers, She said, well, how have I not heard it? And I said, well, where do you normally get your information from? And she said, oh, Radio 4. I listen to the Today program all the time, So I thought, well, at least this time when I went on the Today program, if she was listening, she'd get to hear the other side, But, so those are the points I want to make. I'll stop now because I think it's good to leave for questions. But I think the issue of us and the alternative people insisting that both sides are heard, insisting with the BBC, you're never going to get them to agree that to only give the Palestinian view, but it is an enormously powerful weapon to say, where is the Palestinian view? When are your journalists going to say that this is, from the Palestinian perspective, a system of apartheid? That the roads are controlled, the trade is controlled, every aspect of people's life is controlled. That tens of thousands of young Palestinians and people from the Palestinian community are routinely being put into prison. That the language of that is utterly distorted. That some people in the Middle East are kidnapped. Other people are arrested, depending on who's describing what action. Why is it that we are not being told the Palestinian view that this is a vicious system of apartheid? Why is that not being reported? And that is such a powerful thing to keep demanding and asking of the television service. Now, I haven't got any great hopes for the BBC, but they are formally required to balance. And if they don't, and as I said on that Today program, even if you can't do balance, you ought to do international law. I just said that to them. I said, even if you can't manage the balance, the BBC ought to be in favour of international law, and you should be reporting international law in relation to this conflict. So those are very powerful arguments, I think, to put forward and to keep making. Don't give up. Keep putting them into papers, writing letters, phoning programs. It's amazing how much access there actually is if you sit and listen in the daytime, even to programs like the Jeremy Vine Pro show, which astonish me sometimes in the stuff that gets on. So there are areas that can be used, and I think that plus the boycott campaign, which gives us an enormous opportunity to talk to ordinary people about the situation and how it can be resolved and what can be done about it and the reasons for the conflict and what people on an everyday level can do about it. Those, I think, are very powerful, important things for us to develop. Okay?